Last summer, I found myself unraveling a web of deceit that I had spun with my own two hands. It all started innocently enough. I was hosting a backyard cookout with my husband, flipping burgers on the grill, the kids splashing in the pool, and me setting out bowls of chips and salads. Everything was comfortable, just as it always was. But then, I realized that secrets were meant to be kept hidden, not whispered over the sound of laughter at a family barbecue. Reliable, secure. I felt a longing that I couldn't quite put into words a few months ago, along with a persistent restlessness that had taken root in my chest. I loved my family and my husband, but I had lost a part of myself along the way. So, when my son in law, Jimmy, approached me to express his gratitude for hosting, his tall, broad shouldered, and effortlessly handsome frame ignited a spark I hadn't felt in years. Delightful, he was the type of man who brought joy to everyone around him. My daughter adored him, and I couldn't be happier for her. However, I'd been noticing little things about him lately, like how he would linger when we talked, how his hand would touch mine when he passed me a plate, or how his gaze would hold mine for longer than needed. It wasn't anything obvious, at least not to anyone else, but these moments made me wonder if I was dreaming or if Jimmy had noticed something about me that I'd almost forgotten existed. On that Sunday, when everyone else was gathered around the grill or splashing in the pool, Jimmy and I found ourselves alone on the patio. Jimmy moved in close enough to me that I could smell the faint scent of his cologne. He thanked me again for inviting them over and said, "You always make everything so nice." His voice was warm and smooth, and we were just out of earshot of their laughing and joking. He grinned, and for a moment I felt a surge of emotion I hadn't felt in years. I tried to push it aside, but it persisted nevertheless. "I'm glad you came." After everyone had gone, the home was dead silent. I couldn't help but think about the events of the day, even though I knew it was inappropriate to do so. It was as if we were the only ones in the world. I tried to tell myself it was just a passing fancy, a harmless crush, and I wasn't going to act on it. But the more I tried to convince myself of that, the more I couldn't help but feel noticed, desired, alive, and Jimmy was married to my daughter. More. As the weeks went by, I looked forward to more chances to see Jimmy, dinners, birthdays, and the 4th of July picnic. But every time we were able to find moments alone, we had quiet conversations in the kitchen, laughed at silly stories together, and shared knowing glances that lingered for just a second too long. It was like a game we both knew we shouldn't be playing, but we couldn't stop playing. With each encounter, their connection blossomed. On one occasion, after a particularly long day at work, I was scrolling through social media when I came across a photo from our last family picnic. In the picture, everyone was laughing and carefree, but my eyes went straight to Jimmy. I zoomed in on his face, my heart racing. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't help myself the temptation to fix my attention on him. I began to dress differently for these gatherings, choosing outfits that flatter my figure, wearing perfume that I hadn't used in years, and putting a little extra effort into my hair and makeup. I told myself it was for my confidence, but deep down, I knew I was doing it for Jimmy. I wanted him to notice me, to continue noticing me more. The more I stared at him, the more I wanted to understand his thoughts and feelings as he looked at me that night. I had a vivid and intense dream about him, the kind that makes you gasp for air when you wake up. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was all in my head, but it had deeper significance. It meant I couldn't continue to deny how I felt. At first, our texts were just harmless small talk. I would ask him about a recipe or send him a humorous meme. But as our chats progressed, he opened up about his career, hobbies, and frustrations. In response to his inquiries about my life and emotions, I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't in a long time. It was a relief to finally feel seen, understood, and wanted, and I knew it washes us, but I couldn't help but play with fire nevertheless. Jimmy gave me a new lease on life, making me feel like more than just a wife and mother. I felt like a real woman again. Despite my best efforts to convince myself that our relationship could remain platonic, that we could simply be friends, I knew in my heart that I was deceiving myself. The tension between us intensified with each conversation, glance, and brief touch. It was as if we were dancing on the brink of something we knew we shouldn't do, but couldn't resist. I vowed to myself that I would stop, that I would set a boundary that we wouldn't cross. But every time I saw him, I felt like a woman again. Despite my best efforts to keep it platonic, like we could just be friends, I knew in my heart that I was deceiving myself. The tension between us grew with every conversation, every glance, and brief touch. It was as if we were teetering on the brink of an irresponsible act that neither of us could resist. We danced on the edge of our control. I vowed to myself that I would put an end to it, that I would set boundaries and not cross them. But I couldn't help but feel a strong pull and an irresistible chemistry whenever I was in his presence. All of a sudden, we were on our own once more. It was a straightforward moment. Simply the sitting down next to me, his hand gently brushing against mine as he grabbed for a glass of water. We locked eyes. For an instant, I thought he may say anything, but instead, he simply smiled and murmured, "You're really amazing." The rest of the family was outside. You have no idea how hard I tried to cover up my blush with laughter. "I feel like you're praising me too much." As he said, my pulse raced, and I felt that old flutter in my chest, and I uttered a slightly quivering, "No, I mean it." In response, he said in a firm and genuine voice, "You have this incredible way of making everyone feel special." Chest, I should have placed some distance between us, but I couldn't help but be captivated by his presence and the feelings he evoked in me. In that instant, I realized I wasn't quite sure I wanted to end our connection. More significant, whenever we were alone, our conversations would always lead me into something I wasn't prepared to deal with. Jimmy had a way of making me feel at ease, so I could relax and let him see me for who I really was, a woman with desires and a life outside of her roles as a mother and a wife. We continued our little dance at every family gathering, and it got more intense with each passing year. I began to notice how he would find reasons to visit the house when my daughter isn't around to help out with yard work or fix a dripping faucet. My husband never questioned it, just glad to have someone pitching in. But I knew Jimmy was really trying to make it easier for me to be around him, so we could have those alone moments. As our time together grew, I started to wonder if he was experiencing the same things I was. When he thought I wasn't paying attention, he would look at me. His compliments became more personal and meaningful. And then there were those touches, just barely enough to be innocent, but lingering enough to make me think they weren't one. Jimmy dropped by to help fix a broken screen door while my husband ran errands, and the kids were at their grandparents' house. I wanted to tell him no because I didn't want to be alone, but I also wanted to see him and hear his to express how they feel. A surge of exhilaration coming to crave, I couldn't help but smile as he walked through the door. "Thanks for coming," I said, attempting to sound casual. "No problem," he said, his tone unchanged while his eyes revealed a different story. Down the road, I escorted him. Looking at the door, he noticed the screen hanging awkwardly and the frame bent out of shape. He ran his hands over the corners of the frame and then glanced at me, saying, "This shouldn't take long." He then proceeded to fix it, saying that it would be good as new with just a few screws. His words escaped. He finished fixing the door and stood wiping his hands on his jeans. "There you go," he said, smiling. "Thank you," I said, trying not to let my voice quiver. "I appreciate it, no problem." He repeated it, but this time his tone was more serious. His tone had changed. It was softer and more personal. He drew nearer, his eyes meeting mine. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here." My heart raced, and I couldn't control my urge to verbalize how much it meant to me. Instead, I nodded, hoping he could see the gratitude in my eyes. He lingered for a moment longer, then picked up his tools and headed for the door. As I watched him leave, my heart raced again. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't help but feel the pressure. Then Jimmy woke up. I was consumed by an overwhelming sensation that I couldn't suppress. It was a sense of vitality I hadn't had in years, and the most frustrating thing was that I didn't want it to end. As I stood in the kitchen, my gaze fixated on the repaired door, which served as a metaphor for my inner turmoil. Something shattered being reassembled, yet with a new twist now that I was conscious of the emotions Jimmy had rekindled, which I had forgotten I still had. I was at a loss as to how to. I only nodded in the hopes that he would notice the gratitude in my eyes. He stayed a little while longer before gathering his tools and leaving. My heart was racing as I watched him go, and even though I knew I was playing with fire, I was unable to stop. The worst part was that I didn't want my mind to stop racing as I stood in the kitchen, because Jimmy had reawakened something inside of me that I couldn't ignore, and that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. My daughter's birthday party was the next time I saw Jimmy, and the house was filled with laughter, music, and the smell of chocolate cake as I moved from room to room. Staring at the now fixed door was like a metaphor for what was happening inside me. Something broken being pieced back together, but not in the way it once was. Jimmy had sparked feelings I hadn't realized I still had, and now that I knew I had them, I didn't know how to put them back to sleep. Ensuring that everyone had what they needed, but I was constantly conscious of Jimmy's presence. I saw him watching me from the other side of the living room, his face unreadable, and when our eyes locked, he gave me a tiny smile that made my heart skip a beat. He followed me into the kitchen as I was refilling the punch bowl and asked if I needed a hand in a voice that was low enough only I could hear. Yes. Here I tried to sound casual as he took the ladle from me and started pouring drinks for the guests who were standing so close that I could feel his arm warming mine. He looked at me and said, "You're really good at this, making everyone feel at home." I realized that my cheeks were getting hot, which is something I've always done. I suppose he leaned in his voice and stopped even lower because it's more than that. You give others a sense of concern. After the party ended and most of the guests had left, I found myself outside on the porch, needing a moment to clear my head. Jimmy joined me a few minutes later, leaning against the railing and looking out at the darkened yard. "You okay?" he asked. I was at a loss for words, and every glance, every word, and every slight brush of his arm against mine felt charged. I was torn between wanting to run and wanting to stay frozen in that moment forever. He turned to face me and said, "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" I wasn't sure how much to reveal, but I suppose we've all been through it in one way or another. He nodded, "Just tired," and stepped closer, his voice soft. "You're allowed to have your own struggles. You don't always have to be the strong one for everyone else." As I stared at him, my pulse was racing. "Thank you so much, Jimmy. Take a moment to..." We just stood there in a heavy but comfortable stillness, and I could feel the words that were not spoken hanging in the air. The tension between us increased with each second that went by. It was both thrilling and horrifying at the same time. Eventually, he broke the silence. He continued softly, I should probably go inside, but if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. I nodded, struggling to find my voice, and he grinned before turning and left me alone with my thoughts, and went back inside the home. The days that followed were a haze of regular work-related tasks and family responsibilities, but I couldn't help but think of Jimmy. I kept playing back our discussions, dissecting every word, glance, and gesture. I knew I should stop, that I should put my marriage, my family, and everything else before him, but every time I saw him, the draw got stronger. During casual visits and family get togethers, we discovered more time alone. We even ran into each other at the grocery store, and every encounter felt like a step closer to something I couldn't quit, define, but urgently desired. I began to realize, even though I had known him for years, there were still small details about him that I had never noticed before, like the way his laughter sounded when we were alone, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the way his voice softened when he said my name, and the way he made me feel like more than just a normal person. He gave me the impression that I was a wife and mother. As much as I tried to ignore it and push those emotions away, I couldn't. Jimmy had become a part of me that I wasn't sure I wanted to let go of, but I also understood the danger. I used to be the woman I believed I'd lost a long time ago. I kept walking that line, balancing on the edge of something I couldn't fully understand but couldn't resist. I told myself I could handle it, that I could keep it from going too far, but deep down, I knew that was a lie. And as much as I tried to hold on to the life, I couldn't stop because I couldn't walk away from the way he made me feel and how he made me see myself. I knew what was at stake, my marriage, my family, my daughter's happiness, but I couldn't stop. I had to adapt the roles I played to the person I was supposed to be, and I felt like I was slipping deeper and deeper into the arms of a man who wasn't mine. The tension had settled into a quiet rhythm that followed me through every moment I spent with Jimmy. Our whispered words turned into brief, meaningful exchanges, and our stolen glances became subtle nods. But the unspoken feelings between us had grown heavier and were nearly impossible to ignore. He would look at me with those piercing blue eyes, and I would wonder what it would be like if I let go and let the dam break. It was another family gathering, and this time, and the house was bustling with activity, with people filtering in and out of rooms, kids running up and down the stairs, and laughter echoing off the walls. I made an effort to pay attention to the conversations going on around me, but my gaze kept going to Jimmy, who was in the kitchen assisting my daughter with some last-minute planning. Later that afternoon, as everyone was settling into the living room for dessert, I slipped outside for a little air. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow across the backyard, and I leaned against the deck railing to let the cool evening breeze in. I caught him looking at me once or twice, his smile lingering a fraction of a second too long. I didn't hear him come outside, and I was thinking about things I shouldn't have been thinking about, like how his voice lowered when he spoke only to me. He asked softly, and I nodded, trying to steady my voice because it got a little loud in there. He smiled, stepping closer, and I looked down at my hands, then back up at him. It's nice out here. He leaned against the railing next to me, his shoulder barely touching mine. Yes. We stood there in silence for a moment. The air between us charged, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. It felt like the world had shrunk to just the two of us. Diminished. Finally, he said, "You've been on my mind a lot lately." My breath caught, but I forced myself to remain composed. Jimmy, although I am aware that he interrupted politely and that we shouldn't be talking, I can't stop thinking about you and wondering if you feel the same way. I turned to face him, my emotions a whirlwind. This isn't right. We can't, he said in a low voice, but it didn't change how I felt. His words hung in the air, and I felt my resolve faltering. I had spent so much time telling myself that I could handle this, that I could control my feelings, but now that he'd said it aloud, the truth was impossible to ignore. I did feel the same way, and I hated myself for it. We can't do this, I said again, my voice shaking. This will hurt too many. Jimmy didn't push or say anything more. He just stood there, his presence both consoling and agonizing. Eventually, I forced myself to speak. We need to stop this. We need to find a way to go back to how things were. He nodded, his jaw tight. I was stuck in that spot, caught between what I knew was right and what my heart was screaming at me to do. I turned to face him once more, my words barely audible above a whisper since I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just needed you to know how I feel. He seemed to want to say more, but he just nodded once more. I know I feel it too, but we need to take a time to stop. I apologized. He said in a heavy voice, I'll give you some space. He then left me alone on the deck and went back inside. I took a deep breath to try to steady myself and push away the pain that had crept into my chest. I told myself that this was the right thing to do, that I needed to let go of whatever it was before it destroyed everything. But as the days went by, I found myself missing him even more. I would mentally replay his voice and see his face, as well as every word he had said that evening. I assumed I couldn't reverse the fact that the silent suffering of acting like nothing was wrong had started to wear me down. Words were no longer necessary for Jimmy and me to express what was happening. Every look, every nuanced gesture, and every well-chosen word was just another thread. We had spent weeks circling each other like moths around a flame, careful not to touch the fire, but unable to turn away from its glare. This understanding, which was woven into the fabric of our unspoken understanding, was based on the principle of restraint, the ability to want without knowing that we were on the verge of something that neither of us could control, warmth. That reasoning grew weaker every day, but I convinced myself that if I could just keep this balance and keep the boundaries intact, I wasn't really doing anything wrong. It was a thin shield against the fact that I was putting my heart, emotions, and thoughts into someone who wasn't my husband. And it all came to a head one rainy afternoon when the sky was gray and heavy, the kind of weather that seemed to burden the soul. It should have been a regular visit when Jimmy came over to return some borrowed equipment, but as soon as I opened the door and saw him standing there with reins stuck to his hair, I felt a pang of something more profound than words could describe. Thank you for bringing things back, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. No problem. And he responded, I figured you might need them before the weekend. I led him to the garage where the tools had originally been stored, and for a while we just stood there, talking about nothing specific, but the tension between us was heavy with unspoken words, and I could feel it growing with every second. I wanted to say something to break the cycle and stop this from getting worse, but I wasn't sure how Jimmy broke the silence first. I've been considering what you said. Before my pulse skipped a beat, he murmured in a low voice that we must stop and that this cannot happen. I know you're right, but he stormed off, and I could see the tension in his eyes. He was just as torn as I was, and I suddenly understood that we were both looking for a means to escape, a method to free ourselves from the emotions that had taken hold. We must cease, I murmured gently to Jimmy. It's unfair to everyone, especially not to my family. I know he said that while stroking his wet hair, but every time I see you, I can't stop thinking about you. Regarding you, I've tried, but it seems like you're always in my head. His words struck me like a tidal wave, and I felt like my resolve was eroding. I knew I should tell him to go, to walk away, and never return, but I was unable to do so, and instead stood there frozen as he approached me. Please, I said, my voice barely audible. Don't make this harder. I don't want to make it harder, he murmured above a whisper, his voice brimming with passion. I simply, I don't know how to let this go. I turned my head away, my hands shaking, and for a long time, we just stood there, listening to the rain on the roof as the only sound between us. Then, without saying anything else, Jimmy turned and left the garage, leaving me standing there in the chilly, empty area, not following. For the following 2 weeks, I attempted to concentrate on my family, career, and life while I watched him leave without saying anything and with a hollow sorrow in my chest. It was painful, but I knew that the only way to regain some semblance of control was to avoid Jimmy as much as possible. I told myself that if I could just keep my distance, the feelings would fade and life would return to normal. But in reality, nothing felt normal anymore. Every time I saw his name in a text message or heard his voice in a brief phone call, that familiar longing would resurface, threatening to undo all the progress I believed I had made. The house was quiet, the kids were asleep, and my husband was out of town on a business trip. One evening, after a particularly trying day, I found myself sitting alone in the living room with a glass of wine in my hand. My heart was racing as I looked through old messages from Jimmy, knowing that I shouldn't call him. I was caught in a cycle of wanting and denying, hoping and despairing. Would just make matters worse, but the temptation was too great, so I composed a brief message saying, I miss you. And before I could stop myself, I clicked send. Almost instantly, I missed you too, we began speaking once more. Hours of late-night chats felt safe because there was no physical contact, just words on a screen. But I knew I was deceiving myself because emotional infidelity was still infidelity. And every message I sent and response I got was a step further down a path I couldn't reverse. I promised myself I would stop, cut off contact, and concentrate on my marriage. But it was like trying to put out a fire that kept rekindling no matter how much water I poured on it. Like, and